Good morning, everybody. Again, this is Mr. Lowe. Today we are working on lesson 7.2. So get your notebooks out. You want to make sure you write down lesson 7.2. You put today's date down there, whatever date this is that you are working on. If you recall from 7.1, where we introduced you to fractions, addition and subtraction of fractions by estimating. So we were finding those fractions for a fraction was either going to be closest to zero, one half, or one whole. We're going to take it one step further. So, in that process of adding and subtracting fractions, estimation is the first step, the first thing we want to try and do just to kind of get us an idea. Then we have to find a common denominator. We are going to use what we call the LCD. The LCD stands for the lowest common denominator. And all that simply means is if I have two fractions, like 3/7 and 4, I don't know, fifths. If I were to find a common denominator, I have to find the lowest common denominator. That's why we want to use the LCD method. The LCD method is pretty simple. We need to list multiples of our two denominators. So I'm going to take all of the multiples of 7. So I start out with 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. Times 3 is 21. Times 4 is 28. Times 5 is 35. And then I list all the multiples of 5 on the other side. So 5 times 1 is 5. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and 35. And I will stop whenever I reach a denominator or a multiple that is exactly the same. So I would say the lowest common denominator for 7 and 35 is going, or 7 and 5 is going to be 35. Okay, so that's the first thing we've got to do is find a lowest common denominator. Once we do that, then we can talk about making equivalent fractions. So making this T-chart over here is a really, really good step. It's a pretty much a guarantee that you're going to be able to find those common denominators. However, there is an additional thing that I would like to introduce you to, and this is kind of how I always start. So I'm going to add one extra page because this is something that I'm doing that's not necessarily different, but we'll see. So if I had two fractions, let's say I had, I don't know, 5/12 and 2/3. Now, I could go over and I could make my T-chart and I could list all the multiples of 12 and all the multiples of 3. 12 times 1 is 12, times 2 is 24. Then I would do 3 times 1 is 3, times 2 is 6, times 3 is 9, times 4 is 12. And I would say right away, there's my common denominator. If you don't want to do this LCD method, one of the first things I would look at your two denominators. Can the smaller denominator, can 3 go into 12? If the answer to that question is yes, if you say yes, 3 goes into 12, I just realized I'm not even on my page. So there we go. Now you're on the right page. If you answer yes, 3 goes into 12, then your lowest common denominator will be 12. Guaranteed. So again, what you're looking at is always start with the lowest, the smallest number, and ask yourself, can the smallest number go into or be divided into the bigger number evenly? If you say yes, then your denominator is going to be that bigger number, 12. Let's try a couple of examples. So I need to find a common denominator for each fraction, and then I'm going to rewrite each fraction as an equivalent fraction. So if I look at 2/5 and 1/6, I'm going to write those two fractions down. 2/5, 1/6. I look at my denominators. Can 5 go into 6? The answer to that is no. That means I have to make a T-chart. I put my denominator 5 here, my 6 here, And what you want to do now is you want to start listing those multiples. So I'm going to do multiples of 5. 5 times 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6. And then I list the multiples of 6. 6 times 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. And I can stop right there because 30 is my lowest common denominator. Now I want you to watch what we do. We take 2/5 and I'm going to make it an equivalent fraction with 30 as my denominator. Well, what did you multiply 5 by to get 30? Well, 5 times 6 is 30. What you do to the denominator, I multiplied my denominator by 6. I need to multiply my numerator by the same thing. 2 times 6 is 12. So 12/30 is equal to 2/5. And then we look at 1/6. And I'll do the same thing. I'll go 1/6 here. I know it's going to be equals. I know my denominator for my second fraction has to be a 30. And now you're just asking yourself, well, 6 times what is 30? Well, that's 6 times 5. What I do to my denominator, I have to do to my numerator. What's 1 times 5? 5. 5/30 is equal to 1/6. So that is the basics behind finding any lowest common denominator and then rewriting those fractions as equivalent fractions. Equivalent meaning equal. So these are all going to be equal to each other. Let's do another example. So here's my two fractions. I got to find a common denominator for each and then rewrite as equivalent fractions. I look at 3/8. So I'm going to write down 3/8. And I'm going to write down 9/20. I know I have to find an equivalent fraction. I ask myself, can 8 go into 20 evenly? Well, the answer there is no. So now I need to start multiplying using my multiplication, make a T-chart with 8 as my denominator here and 20 over here. And then we start multiplying. 8 times 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. And I'm going to stop there. We do 20 times 1, 20 times 2, and there it is. There's my two common denominators, 40. Once I know my denominators in my T-chart, all I have to do now is rewrite these two fractions as equivalent fractions with 40 as my denominator. Well, 8 times what is 40? 8 times 5. Well, then I got to do the same thing to the top. What's 3 times 5? Well, that's 15. And then I look at 9/20 and I say, well, 20 times 2 is 40 and 9 times 2 is 18. That's all you are doing today. So we are looking at these two fractions. We are determining what the common denominator would be. We're going to use the lowest common denominator. And then we are just going to make equivalent fractions. Let's try one more problem. So this one says, find a common denominator for the pair of fractions. Now I have 6/5 and I have 13/20. Remember, we can ask ourselves, can 5 go into 20? As long as you say yes, because 5 goes into 20 4 times. Now that 20 becomes my common denominator. 5 times 4, 6 times 4. 6 times 4 is 24. 20 times 1, 13 times 1. There are my two equivalent fractions with the same denominator, 20. All right, so here's your deal today, guys. You are working again wherever you were left off at. So you should be on lesson 7-2. You have a practice buddy to do, and you have a quick check. Obviously, if you have questions on the practice buddy, come and ask. That would be fantastic. Hope you all have an excellent day.